University of Chicago. So let me first make a brief introduction about him. His interests cover all aspects of math education, with particular emphasis on matters related to curriculum, instruction, and testing, the selection and organization of content, the teaching and learning of mathematics, international mathematics education, teacher education in mathematics, the history of mathematics education, and educational policy. Early in his career, he became known for his curriculum development work in geometry with real-world application of mathematics, and in using the latest technology into the materials. Ideas gleaned from these studies were among those incorporated in the secondary school materials developed in the University of Chicago School Mathematics Project. That's a very big project, which he directed for over 3 decades. He is the author of over 150 published articles and co-author or co-editor dozens of books. He has received Lifetime Achievement Awards from many organizations, including the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics and the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics in the United States, and the International Society for Design and Development of Education. In 2014, NCTM published a book of 38 of his papers. That's the only time NCTM has published a book devoted to the writing of one person. So let's welcome Professor Existing. His topic presentation will focus on the K-12 math education curriculum reform in the United States over 75 years. Okay, let's welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I really
You really need that, yeah, it's too warm.
do that.
Yeah.
We have to get to work. Well, thank you. I hope you don't mind. I'll sit down. Thank you. Thank Dean Fan for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. My remarks today are about curriculum, the content of the mathematics taught in school classrooms. I will say little about how this material is conveyed to students in these classrooms. The time span of this talk includes almost all of the time span of my formal education, as well as my lifetime in the field of mathematics, curriculum, and mathematics education. Like China, the USA is a very large country. Our two countries have about the same area. Unlike Japan and other countries, there is no national curriculum in the United States. The governance of education is left to the 50 individual states. If there's no national curriculum in the United States, how come I cannot move this? Uh-oh. Ah. Thank you. If there's no national curriculum in the United States, nor has there ever been a national curriculum, then how does schools determine what mathematics will be taught? They may look to report from committees, from national organizations, from other national bodies. They are influenced by what are called standardized tests, that is, tests created by companies or corporations in which student results are compared with results of other students, and a percentile level is identified with each student's performance. They're visited by representatives of commercial publishers who wish the school to purchase their company's textbooks and other materials. And for the past 2 decades, they've been able to look online for available materials, some for purchase and some available for free. Schools buy textbooks with state or local funds obtained through taxes. If you live in 20 of the nation's 50 states, your state is a state adoption state, by which it's meant that in each of those states, the state announces a time at which it will consider buying books for a certain course for a year, in this particular year, and the publishers submit books to a state committee which must approve the books. Only books on the approved list can be purchased with state funds. Although the state lists typically contain 5 or more textbooks for each course, it's very competitive to get on the list. Just over half of the population of the United States, 52%, lives in these 20 states. This 52% includes the 3 largest states in population: California, Texas, and Florida. It does not include the state in which I was born, Illinois, and in which I've spent my entire career in the field. The implication is that I have been accustomed to being and dealing with schools with more freedom in what they teach than those who are born in state adoption states. In Illinois and the 30 states with no state adoption, adoptions are done at the city, town, or school district level, which may include several neighboring communities or even at an individual school. All of this applies only to public schools. Private schools, about 12% of the population goes to private schools. That is, schools not supported by state funds can typically adopt any materials they want. Materials are typically adopted by schools for 5 to 7 years. The older materials are often used for much longer if the teachers and their school likes them. Since the 1890s, yes, the 1890s, the basic secondary school mathematics curriculum is that algebra is a 9th grade subject, a year-long geometry course follows, and following that is second-year algebra, sometimes called advanced algebra. Then work, including trigonometry, polynomial and rational functions, and some analytic geometry to prepare students for calculus follows. I view there to have been 6 broad movements in school mathematics in the United States since 1950. Post-World War II emphasis on basic skills, the new math, back to basics, problem-solving UCSMP and NCTM standards, the NSF projects, and the Common Core standards for school mathematics from 2010 until now. I begin with World War II and its aftermath. World War II started in Europe in October 1938. At this time, the United States had been in a major economic depression for 9 years. And remembering World War I, which had occurred just 20 years before, the mood of the country was to avoid getting involved in any international conflict. But in March 1941, with Germany occupying more and more of Europe, by enacting a law called Lend-Lease, the United States sent goods and war materiel to England mainly, but also to Russia and to China in order to combat Germany and Japan. And when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December, that is 7 months or 8 months later, it took only 1 day for the United States to declare war on both Germany and Japan. In fighting the war, pilots and soldiers needed to know something about things such as ballistics, for which geometry, trigonometry, and some algebra is needed, and read maps and deal with numerical information. This exposed the weak mathematical education of the recruits and thus of the general populace. So even before the war ended, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, an organization composed mainly of high school mathematics teachers and teacher trainers, organized a commission on post-war plans. The 3 reports of the commission were published in 1944, 1945, and 1947 in the Mathematics Teacher, and so can be accessed online even today if you're a member of NCTM. These reports contain a detailed delineation of objectives that everyone should know. Notable was the repeating of a recommendation made in 1940, before the war, by the two major professional organizations, the MAA, the Mathematical Association of America, and NCTM, for a two-track system in grades 9 through 12, two tracks. One track with a year of algebra followed by a year of plane geometry, and half years of solid geometry and trigonometry, and 2 more semesters of algebra, as I've described, was already in place. The other track devoted to what was called general mathematics, mainly 2 years of arithmetic and its applications. At that time, this recommendation meant that about half the students would go into an algebra to calculus track, and half the students would go to arithmetic, more arithmetic. But even that half that went into the track, only maybe 15% ever went through 4 years of mathematics. They were in the track, but they dropped out. Accurately feeling that the war had been won because of advancements in mathematics, engineering, and science, including radar, better aircraft, code breaking, and atomic energy, the writers of the post-war plans report gave great attention to why mathematics was important. So there was a call for the inclusion of applications of mathematics throughout the curriculum, and in 25 pages, the report describes how math is used in personal affairs by trained workers in many fields, by trained people in what today we call the mathematical sciences, and by civil service workers. Another section, devoted to opportunities for women in mathematics, includes all the opportunities that men might have, but excludes the possibility that women could become research mathematicians. Fortunately, some things do change. I'm not accustomed to moving this way. The 1950s began with a booming economy and the view that the US had shown it to be the most powerful country in the world. And there was a hint of a movement in mathematics education. In 1951, the University of Illinois Committee on School Mathematics, UICSM, was initiated with the goal of bringing the mathematics studied in school more in line with mathematics as done by mathematicians. With the idea of being at the forefront of mathematics, UICSM was undoubtedly influenced by the Bourbaki school in France. Famous mathematicians comprised the Bourbaki school. Most of them were French, but not all. And that school began publishing books on rigorous theoretical mathematics, starting even before World War II. In February of 1954, NCTM published the first issue of a new journal, The Arithmetic Teacher. The NCTM had published yearbooks in 1935 and 1941 on the teaching of arithmetic. With this new journal, NCTM acknowledged the ongoing importance mathematics in grades K through 8 had as a grounding for later mathematics study. And in the summer of 1957, the National Science Foundation funded the beginnings of a project that would significantly change K-12 mathematics. The School Mathematics Study Group, SMSG. Under its director, Ed Beagle, first at Yale and then at Stanford University, SMSG created materials for all grades K through 12, popularized research in mathematics education, and involved large numbers of professors and teachers. SMSG was the most significant mathematics education project of the 20th century in the United States. It operated for 20 years until 1977, when Beagle terminated it. But just after the first funding of SMSG, came a development that the US was unprepared for, the launch of Sputnik by the USSR in October of 1957. The launch of Sputnik showed that the Soviet Union had the ability to send large bombs anywhere in the world. And because Sputnik had a shining light on it, Everywhere in the United States and in most of the world, its movement could be noticed in the sky at predictable times. I remember seeing Sputnik. The alarm could not be ignored, and thus began a concerted attempt to catch up to the Russians. For 10 years, the Soviets were ahead of the USA in getting to the moon. For 10 years, the United States was ahead. But by 1968, the US had caught up. And as you know, the US put the first people on the moon in 1969. An extraordinary achievement, given that the computers of that time had far less processing ability than the handheld calculators in the 1990s. Can you imagine? Incredible. With almost no computing ability to do that. Sputnik became the catalyst for a flurry of curriculum development, and UICSM, the Illinois project, and remember, I'm from the state of Illinois, and SMSG became two of the organizations whose curriculum work became termed the new math. Here is the cover and table of contents of the first half of SMSG's first algebra course from 1960. The SMSG materials were soft cover and never became the property of a commercial publisher. That is, they were never sold for a profit. However, commercial publishers quickly produced textbooks similar to those of SMSG, and by 1966, materials influenced by SMSG were in the majority of United States schools. The new math era produced changes in school mathematics that continue to exist today in the United States. Mathematics in grades K through 6 started to include the very beginnings of geometry and algebra. Before then, they were all arithmetic. Texts for grades 7 and 8 contain chapters on algebra and geometry, and teaching a full algebra course to selected 8th graders started to become widespread. That is moving the high school curriculum a year down. At the high school level, separate courses in plane geometry and solid geometry. At the high school level, separate courses in plane geometry and solid geometry were combined into a one-year geometry course, and for many students, trigonometry was integrated into second-year algebra or the pre-calculus course. Functions became a major theme in second-year algebra and in a 12th grade course designed to prepare students for calculus. Separate course, calculus at that time was a second-year college course, not a first-year course. It was a second-year college. Separate courses in analytic geometry and theory of equations disappeared from mathematics in four-year colleges. The changes were so significant that massive retraining of teachers was needed, and much of the retraining was done in summer and full-year institutes for teachers at colleges and universities throughout the country, supported by the National Science Foundation. Not all characteristics of the new math courses have survived. Texts at many grades began with a chapter on sets, intersection of sets, union of sets, so on. Venn diagrams and bases other than base 10 became mainstays of the curriculum, and students were tested on those ideas. However, from the time the new math began, there were rumblings. Applications of mathematics to the real world were quite rare in the new math curriculum. Why all this theory? Of what good is knowledge about sets and the commutative property? Isn't the problem that our students don't have the skills they need? People would tell stories. I went into the store the other day, bought an item for $3.62, and gave the cashier $4.02 to make it easy to make change. And this simply confused the cashier. The loudest voice decrying the lack of applications, Morris Klein, a professor of mathematics at New York University, participated in many debates at NCTM meetings and was often treated with disrespect by NCTM audiences and many quarters of the profession. An article he wrote in the Mathematics Teacher in 1966 was followed by an article decrying his view. The only time I can remember an article being written specifically to denounce a previous article in the same issue. The early part of the 1970s was highlighted by a movement called Back to Basics, with an emphasis on translating mathematical goals in what were termed behavioral objectives or performance objectives. Give the right answer, whether or not you can explain the underlying mathematics concepts. Sort of just the opposite of new math. Morris Klein, the same person I mentioned before, wrote a book, Why Johnny Can't Add, The Failure of the New Math. It became a bestseller. The Back to Basics movement was helped by the results of the first countrywide National Assessment of Mathematical Progress. National Assessment of Mathematical Progress, NAEP, we call it NAEP, in 1973. Performance in mathematics did not meet people's expectations. This is a theme always throughout. Performance on these tests never meet people's expectations. The Back to Basics movement alarmed the National Science Foundation and the mathematics education community because they had supported the new math. The money and efforts that have been poured into the new math curricula and teacher retraining to teach the new math now seem to be for naught. The U.S. Congress dramatically reduced the NSF budget for curriculum development. This slide shows a page from the first year algebra text published by Holt Publishing in 1974. Notice there is no explanation, no justification for what is shown, just a display of the steps to solve linear equations in one variable. The Holt series of books became a bestseller, competing well with books that were influenced by SMSG. And just around this time, the results of what later was called the First International Mathematics Study, but today we call the International Mathematics Study, TIMS, but this we now call this FIMS because it was the first, but it wasn't called the first when it came out because it was only one. That study involved 13-year-olds from 12 countries, with Japanese students scoring best, and at the bottom of the performance list were the United States and Sweden. Although students in the U.S. who were studying from new math curricula outperformed others in the U.S., the results were taken as a sign that mathematics education in the U.S. needed more improvement. NSF, that is the National Science Foundation, needed to react. In 1975, they created a National Advisory Committee on Mathematics Education, NACOM, under the direction of Shirley Hill, a professor at the University of Missouri at Kansas City. NACOM produced a report. NACOM, under the direction of Shirley Hill, produced a report with the green color here, indicating that we need to rethink what we teach and how we teach. In the same year, the National Institute of Education had a conference on basic skills with its own 2-volume report with the cover of the first volume shown here in orange. The NIE conference led the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics, NCSM, an organization only a few years old, to redefine what was meant by basic skills, published as a position paper in a 4-page folded newsletter. This 4-page report is short enough. Notice the other reports were in volumes. This is in 4 pages, and it's short enough I can show the whole report on one slide. All you have to do is enlarge it. You can read the whole report. It was a brilliant move. They said, we like basic skills, we're just going to change what the basic skills are. Page 2 of this report identifies 10 basic skills. What were they? They read reasonably well, almost a half century later. Problem solving, applying mathematics to everyday situations, alertness to the reasonableness of results, estimation and approximation, appropriate computational skills, geometry, measurement, reading, interpreting, and constructing tables, charts, and graphs, using mathematics to predict computer literacy. The success of this paper led NCTM, the teachers, remember the other supervisors, now with Shirley Hill, the same person who had done the NACOM report, was the president of NCTM, and they came out in 1980 with a little booklet entitled Agenda for Action, asserting that rather than computational skill, problem solving was the most important skill of school mathematics, most important goal. Problem solving became the mantra of the field, enveloping both researchers and teachers. If you want to look at research, if you're doing research on problem solving, go back to the 1980s, because there was a ton of research done on problem solving in that decade. And after more than a decade of falling average scores on college entrance exams in the 1970s, the scores bottomed out in 1981, and they started a long rise that lasted for 3 decades, until 2011. In the same year, Ronald Reagan, 1980, Ronald Reagan became president. And having been the governor of California, a state adoption state, he wanted to reduce the nation's government's involvement in education. Rather than relying on the National Science Foundation for support, he encouraged industry to invest in education. It was this environment in which the University of Chicago School of Mathematics project was born. I was specifically asked to speak about UCSMP, and I will do so now for 7 or 8 hours. No. I could speak for 7 or 8 hours, I won't. But first about its overall history and structure, and then specifically about my work. All right, let me back up. Now I can do it. The person responsible for the birth of UCSMP was Isaac Virgil, a professor of mathematics at the university. He was born in Lithuania, and in 1958, just months after the launch of Sputnik, he used his knowledge of Eastern European languages to head a project called Survey of East European Mathematical Literature, funded by the National Science Foundation. Isaac was a staunch anti-communist, but had high respect for Soviet mathematics education, and his project translated many books about mathematics and mathematics education into English. In 1979, he had sent a report to the National Science Foundation decrying the low expectations of mathematics curricula in the United States. By the way, the other principal investigator on this project, the survey, was Jeremy Kilpatrick, a name well known worldwide in our field, who by this time was at the University of Georgia. That is the state of Georgia, not the country. In 1982, using the leverage of Ronald Reagan's call for industry involvement in education, Virchow befriended Keith McHenry, an executive at the Amoco Corporation. Amoco is an oil company, American Oil Company, AMOCO, with the idea to fund a major mathematics curriculum improvement project in grades 11 and 12 in the Chicago public schools. Amoco has its headquarters in Chicago. It was at this point that I and a number of other faculty at the University of Chicago were brought into the discussion because the university could not imagine a project in school mathematics that did not involve its world-famous Department of Education, and in particular me, who had written 3 innovative courses for secondary school mathematics by this time, and I had just been promoted to full professor. When a group of faculty got together in the fall of 1982, by the way, the most famous professor in the Department of Education in Chicago was Benjamin Bloom, known for Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. This was quite a department. When a group of faculty got together in the fall of 1982 to discuss the proposal, the feeling was unanimous. Starting at grades 11 and 12 was far too late. You needed to start at kindergarten or grade 1. And the University of Chicago's work was national, if not international, in its reach, and there should be no geographical limits to the work that we do. In this one meeting, it was decided that we should go K-12, and I suggested that we name the project the University of Chicago School Mathematics Project, UCSMP, an homage to the most famous mathematics curriculum development project in the world, the School Mathematics Project in England. Through the efforts of Keith McHenry, Amoco provided the first funding, $6 million over 6 years, an unprecedented amount of money for a project and an unprecedented length of time for a project. Ultimately, Amoco continued funding for 9 years, and UCSMP operated strongly for about 25 years, during which I estimate UCSMP received over $20 million of external funding from industry and government sources, equivalent to about 40 million US dollars today. Faculty from the Department of Education and the Department of Mathematics led the project from the start. The university, always supportive of interdepartmental cooperation, I'm sure the same is true here, loved this cooperative effort between mathematics and education. We organized into 5 components, they're named here. Isaac Virchow was at this time within 2 years of retirement, and the university would not let him be the overall director. He convinced Paul Sally, a colleague in the mathematics department, to be the director. Paul was charismatic, interested in the cultivation of mathematical talent in schools, and highly respected in the mathematics research community. He suggested a component to create materials for training elementary school teachers, figuring you need to train the teachers before you can expect them to teach the new materials. The other components were directed by professors from the Department of Education. It's important to note that by the time UCSMP first began in 1983, the second international mathematics study had been conducted, involving 24, oh, I'm sorry, involving 24 jurisdictions, including Hong Kong. And by this time, there had been 3 ICME conferences in France, Germany, and the United States. Mathematics education had become worldwide. It was natural that the resources component, that is ESOC's component, would translate materials from the Soviet Union. But we convinced him that it was the Japanese who were scoring highest in the international studies, and we wanted to see their materials. In particular, the Japanese work convinced me that a major problem in US education was that mathematics in grade 8 was mainly a review of grades 1 through 7, and what was needed was a major upgrade of what you might call lower secondary school mathematics. So the resource component immediately translated Japanese textbooks from grades 7 through 9, but they also translated Soviet textbooks from grades 1 through 10. The component also organized in 1985 the first of what would be 4 international conferences, inviting leaders in mathematics education from all over the world to the university to present their work, with the proceedings published by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. Big volume. In 1987, 4 years after the beginning of UCSMP, Paul Sally, who also directed other projects at UCSMP, resigned as director. And the next day, I was asked to be the director of UCSMP. And then I became the director for the next 30 years, 32 years. Now allow me to focus specifically on my work and on the development of UCSMP materials for grades 7 through 12. Before UCSMP began, I had already written materials for each of the 4 years of a typical high school mathematics program: algebra, geometry, a second year of algebra, and pre-calculus mathematics. All but the pre-calculus book were innovative in ways suggested by their titles. Geometry, a transformation approach. geometry and advanced algebra with transformations and applications. Algebra through applications with probability and statistics. All these titles were new for the time. All these 3 books have been developed and tested over a 3-year time span, a first year of writing while teaching the new materials, while I taught them, a second year of study in a small number of schools, and a 3rd year of use and study in a larger number of schools. This 3-year development process is one that we would apply in the development of the UCSMP courses for grades 7 through 12. 2 projects that I directed that did not involve textbooks also influenced our plans. A project dealing with applications of arithmetic showed that a large percentage of students came into high school not even being introduced to a variety of applications of arithmetic. So how could they be expected to apply algebra if they couldn't apply arithmetic? And a project testing the von Hille theory of levels of development in geometry indicated that most students did not have even a rudimentary knowledge of geometry, so how could they be expected to use deduction to organize geometric concepts? As a consequence of all of this work before UCSMP, in 1983, before UCSMP was organized, I had already planned to go into school to work on a course before algebra. A course that would proceed and would correct the gaps in arithmetic and cover the prerequisites students needed for success in algebra and geometry. So the existence of UCSMP fit perfectly into my plans. I was already planning to go into schools with a new course. The result was a course that we were to call Transition Mathematics, a transition between the mathematics of grades K through 6 and the study of courses in algebra and geometry traditionally in grades 9 and 10. This became the first UCSMP course to be written, and the only UCSMP course for which I single-handedly wrote the first draft. From 1985 to 1990, we developed the 5 other courses that would constitute the UCSMP curriculum for most students in grades 7 through 12. A grade earlier for some, a grade later for others. This idea that all students should go through the same curriculum, but not necessarily at the same time, was a new idea for the U.S. And it caused a substantial change in the percent of students taking algebra in grade 8. Not just UCSMP's course, but even other algebra courses. And it increased from 5% of the population taking algebra in grade 8 to 30%, over 30% taking algebra in grade 8. The first 4 courses of these 6 were directly influenced by the materials I had written in the previous years before UCSMP. Two characteristics of these materials were influential quite generally. Using real-world applications to introduce and motivate the mathematics, not just for practicing skills. The usual thing at that time was you did the skills mathematically, and then at the end of the chapter, you would have the problems involving those skills. We reversed the procedure. Or let me say we did them simultaneously. Assuming availability of calculator and computer technology, whereas before UCSMP, not only was technology not used, but in many places calculators were not allowed. Calculators first came out in the very early 1970s, very expensive. But by 1980, they were cheap. And by 1983, at the beginning of UCSMP, they were really quite cheap, and still they were not being used. Also, UCSMP materials included mathematics that had been essentially absent from the curriculum, employing the geometric transformations in geometry, graphing, and trigonometry, giving great attention to statistics in the grade 11 course, and giving great attention to to discrete mathematics in the pre-calculus course. By discrete mathematics, I mean logic, recursion, combinatorics, networks, that's what I mean by discrete mathematics. In all this, we were helped by others in the country who were advocating and doing some of the same things, notably Henry Pollack and Saul Garfunkel for mathematical modeling, and Bert Waits and Frank DeManna for technology. But the fact that we had a full curriculum made us stand out. Among the content innovations, along with the content innovations, were some process innovations in developing the materials. We selected the lead authors and the members of the author teams, which contained from 3 to 6 people, not publishers selected them. We selected. We brought the authors together in summers to work for 6 to 8 weeks full-time writing, all in the same room, a room about this size with a huge table in the middle, huge table, sitting around the table, all writing at the same time, passing materials to each other. Very efficient. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we had a 3-year testing program. The development of commercial textbooks had none of these characteristics. From the beginning of UCSMP, we were helped by the advice of 2 advisory boards, one for grades K through 6, the other for grades 7 through 12. These consisted of some of the best mathematics educators in the country, and they helped spread the message of our project's goals. And then in 1985, while we were planning, writing, and testing our materials, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, recognizing the same problems that had led to the creation of UCSMP, brought together a set of committees to draft standards for school mathematics, national standards for school mathematics. And members of the UCSMP advisory boards, our advisory boards, were on those committees. In 1989, just as Transition Mathematics, the first book from UCSMP, appeared, NCTM published the most influential report in its history, the Curriculum and Evaluation Standards for School Mathematics. This book-length report contains rationales for teaching what we teach and is split into grade bands, K4, 5, 8, 9, 12. Glenn DeLappin, who was on our advisory board, headed the 5 to 8 team. Jim Schultz, who became a lead author on our function statistics and trigonometry course, was also on this committee. At all grade levels, strong attention was given to processes, problem solving, reasoning, communication, and connections. The first of these 2 processes might be thought of as continuing the ideas of the new math and the emphasis on problem solving in that decade. The content changes that were encouraged by NCTM included many of the characteristics of the UCSMP curriculum. More attention to statistics, discrete mathematics, and applications of mathematics. Decreased emphasis on complicated calculations. Increased use of calculator and computer technology. And consideration of breaking up the full year in algebra and geometry courses at high school into a curriculum in which many ideas would be studied each year. You know, it's always in the history of the United States, algebra has been a course, geometry a separate course, taught at different times. When I first visited China in 1991, I was surprised to learn that algebra and geometry were being taught on alternate days in Shanghai to the same 8th graders. Quite different, nothing like that in the United States. The content changes that were encouraged by NCTM included many of the characteristics, as I said. We had seriously considered the idea of integrating algebra and geometry together. But I vetoed the idea because I thought it was going to be difficult enough to implement the UCSMP curriculum without having to actually change the whole nature of what had been the curriculum since 1890s. So I kept the courses separate, but then integrated algebra into the geometry, and geometry into the algebra, and still they were basically algebra and geometry courses. Even today, over 3 decades later, only a small percent of schools teach an integrated, what we call an integrated curriculum. I think it's under 5%, small percent, certainly under 10%. But in the last 2 courses of UCSMP, we did integrate content in statistics with content in pre-calculus mathematics, and we integrated discrete mathematics into the pre-calculus course. How would the NCTM standards be implemented? This question arose. I'm now done speaking of UCSMP. This question arose at just about the same time as the first UCSMP textbooks appeared. The reaction to transition mathematics in the 2 algebra courses was immediate and positive, and I was told firsthand by people at NSF that it had led NSF to believe that government funds to develop curricula in agreement with the NCTM standards would be a good investment for the government. A call for proposals was put out. We sought funds for computer enhancements and other things that they're called ancillary materials. But our proposal was not funded. Welcome to the real world. Because NSF correctly responded that our publisher would create any ancillary materials that would be needed for our courses. They were correct. But the UCSMP curriculum for grades K through 6, called Everyday Mathematics, under the direction of Max Bell, was funded. And funds from Amoco had enabled the first few grades of that curriculum to be developed, but the rest was developed with NSF funds. And what they, together with the secondary, enabled us to complete the curriculum from grades K through 12. In all, NSF funded 13 large multi-year projects of curriculum development in the 1990s. This slide shows the names of all 13. Some of these projects' materials still have reasonable usage. You may know the names Connected Math, or Investigations, or IMP, or Core Plus, or Everyday Mathematics. Perhaps the most salient of the differences between these and previous curricula is the inclusion of realistic or authentic applications to introduce concepts, often using real data either supplied to students or found by them. A partner in this move of the curriculum was the emergence of statistics, as far more than just the calculation of mean, median, and mode, to include the collection and analysis of data. The 1990s was the first decade in which statistics became more than a passing interest in school mathematics. As a consequence of the NSF funding, UCSMP was able to complete, I said we were done with UCSMP, but I wasn't completely. UCSMP was able to complete its original goal of developing the curriculum from kindergarten to grade 12. But it was in 2 parts with different directors, Max Bell and myself, some different funding, different methods for selecting authors, and different ways in which the materials were tested, as this slide shows. The paths to commercial publication were also quite different. In 1987, after a competition in which 6 publishers submitted proposals to publish the UCSMP materials, and they submitted these proposals not having seen, we hadn't even finished some of the materials, we selected Scott Forsman, a major publisher. Transition Mathematics became the best-selling textbooks in the country, and the UCSMP materials competed well against the other major publishers. Unusual for a university project. We quickly prepared and tested a second edition of our materials because we changed the technology usage. Technology was changing so fast. But in 1996, Scott Forsman, our publisher, was sold to Pearson Prentice Hall, another major publisher, but that publisher's sales force had been selling against our materials. The salespeople have been selling against UCSMP for years. There's no way they were going to turn around and sell our materials because of their publisher. We then moved the publishing to the Wright Group, a division of McGraw-Hill, with the possibility of all UCSMP materials then, K through 12, being sold by the same publisher. But McGraw-Hill had a very successful series in grades 9 through 12 and 7 through 10. We were again ignored, so then we moved the materials back to the University of Chicago. So they're available from the University of Chicago, but there's been no development of this program for the last 9 years, and none is planned. Max Bell called his curriculum Everyday Mathematics, and a remarkable woman, Joanne Schiller, accurately sensing that the materials would be a commercial success, created a company, the Everyday Learning Corporation, to publish the materials. In 1995, this company was sold and then bought by McGraw-Hill, and became a bestseller, bringing the University of Chicago the most royalties it had ever earned from any project, shocking the university, since it was thought that major royalties would come either from medical breakthroughs or other scientific research, not from education. The success of the curriculum and evaluation standards of NCTM led them to bring people together to immediately create professional teaching standards for school mathematics. That emphasized the importance of classroom discourse between students and among students and between students and teachers. Then in 1995, the NCTM assessment standards appeared. These three standards documents constitute a high point in the history of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. The late 1990s saw a continued move towards almost universal implementation of curricula, very much influenced by the NCTM standards and the 13 NSF projects, which by this time even influenced the commercial materials. And due to the increased attention to statistics, in 1997, the College Board implemented an advanced placement exam in statistics. Things went so well for the standards that in 2000, culminating the 20th century, NCTM did not want to change significantly what it had recommended in 11 years before. So it introduced the principles and standards for school mathematics. This document summarized the three preceding standards document, but refined the grade bands and added 6 principles defining how mathematics education should be conducted, principles that dealt with equity, curriculum, reading, teaching, learning, assessment, and technology. As a result of the need for changes and the excitement generated by the NCTM standards and the newer curricula and developments in the years from 1999 to 2001, over 20,000 mathematics teachers from grades K through 12 and mathematics teaching educators attended their annual meeting. 20,000 is a lot of people. So what happened? A particularly significant thrust on the teaching of mathematics came in 2001 from outside mathematics, with the federal No Child Left Behind Act as a national act. Every state became required to test students every year in language arts and mathematics in all grades 3 through 8 and in high school, with summary results for each school made public. Not for the students, but by school. Creating such tests is not easy and expensive. It's quite expensive. And the development exposed the fact that in the same grade, some states were testing this concept, but other states were testing some other concept. They just did it differently. And they were requiring the different mathematics at different grades. There is also criticism that the NSF programs and the commercial text that they influenced included much content that might be interesting, but was not essential to a child's mathematics education. You know, it's like applications, it's fluff. The real stuff is the mathematics. By testing students so often, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 reflected a backlash against change. A school could not easily try out new materials if its students were going to be tested on an old curriculum. The era of new curricular initiatives had ended. The backlash began from mathematicians because developments in the 1990s had created difficulties for college-level mathematics departments. First, more high school graduates were going to college, many being the first in their families to attend college. As this graph of the percent of high school graduates who immediately enrolled in college shows, the percent of high school graduates who attended college the next year after graduation, they're 18-year-olds for the most part. It increased from 50% to 70% in the 3 decades from 1980 to 2009, 50% to 70%. These students tended not to be as well prepared as earlier students. This forced colleges to offer high school level courses so that these students could succeed in calculus, the traditional first-year college course. Second, the rise of statistics and courses in computer science in high school, reflected in some of the newer curricula, were taking time away from preparation for skills for calculus. Paper and pencil skills for the most part, because college mathematics departments were reluctant to allow students to use technology, even graphic calculators, in their courses. Third, calculus as the traditional first mathematics course in college was being replaced for many students by introductory statistics and courses in computer science and the information sciences. This threatened the major sequence of courses traditionally taken by mathematics majors. A report in 2008 by a mathematics advisory panel formed by the U.S. Department of Education emphasized that K-8 education should focus more on fractions and ideas of algebra than seemed to be the case in many schools. It's significant that no one on this panel was a key figure in any of the NSF curriculum projects of the 1990s. So it is perhaps understandable that in this report, the study of statistical ideas was entirely ignored, and the use of calculators for computation was decried. This report influenced a broader and far more significant reaction formed by the governors and chief state school officers that appeared in 2010, the Common Core. The Common Core was developed for both mathematics and language arts under the auspices of the chief education officers of 43 of the 50 states. Not all the states participated, but 43 is a lot. Its specifications, covering grades K through 12, were originally published in 2010 at the web address, do I have that? Yes, it's on this slide. The web address is here. And they have not been modified since, not one word. It's 15 years and they have not been modified. The rationale for the Common Core was based on 6 assumptions about the situation of mathematics education in the United States. First, that there were substantial achievement gaps among our population. This was true in 2010, and it's still true now. That existing curricula in the U.S. are incoherent. This contention was based on the fact that different states often tested at different grade levels, a natural situation when curricula had changed recently. It was not based on analyses of individual curriculum, like, for example, UCSF's Everyday Mathematics, which, as I've noted, was a best-selling textbook series, which was very nice and very smooth, and so were the other textbook series. But if you take them all, they're not all the same. Third, that the U.S. scored poorly compared to other countries on international tests. This was true, but carried with it the undertone that the U.S. used to be among the top countries, of all countries in performance, which of course was not true. Always not so. There were 2 other assumptions that might be viewed as political, in that they carried with them that this was a national problem that could not be solved by the existing leaders in mathematics education. That the U.S. economy would suffer unless we do as well as the highest scoring countries in the world. It wasn't true then, and it isn't true now. And lastly, since the NCTM standards of 1989 and the NSF curriculum of the 1990s, U.S. performance internationally and nationally had gone down, which also is not true. From this last assumption came the view that created the structure called the Common Core, that leadership in mathematics education should be taken away from NCTM, mathematics teachers, and the mathematics education community. And how did the Common Core people know this? Because many high school and college teachers in mathematics tell us that the students they see are not as good as the students they used to see. Well, this is probably true because more students were taking all these courses. They're getting population that never took these courses. Here is a table of indicators of U.S. performance nationally from 1980 until the time the Common Core was published in 2010. I've put in all of the major indicators. Scores on national assessment, SAT and ACT scores, these are the college entrance scores, AP exams, enrollments in more advanced mathematics at various grade levels in middle and high school. The rows of the table go up the grades. At 4th grade, national assessment scores had very significantly improved. In 8th grade, the percent of students taking algebra had gone from 13% to 41%. I said 30%, so I think this 41% is a little phony. You could easily argue that the 41% would not generally perform as high as the 13%. But the mean national assessment score had also improved. On all of these indicators, there were substantial and sometimes unprecedented improvements in the 2 decades after the NCTO standards. For instance, the fraction of high school graduates with 2 years of algebra increased from 44% to 78%. This was due in major part to individual states requiring 2 years of algebra for graduation. And there was a dramatic increase in advanced placement calculus, and as a result, from 2005 on, more students took calculus in high school than took it in college. There were 2 major consequences of these increases from college mathematics departments. I mentioned them. The first is that college mathematics departments were not seeing huge numbers of the best students. These students were passing out of the college requirements because they took calculus in high school. The second is that mathematics departments in both high schools and colleges were seeing larger numbers of students in their later high school mathematics courses who never before would have gotten this far. They're not the same students of the population of the previous generation. This explains why college mathematics departments thought the situation in pre-college mathematics was worse than it had been, when in fact it was better. It's difficult to compare the performance of US students in 2010, when the Common Core standards appeared, with the recent performance, because the pandemic of 2020 caused a decline in school learning from which we have still not completely recovered. I don't know what the situation is in China. Let me know. But this graph shows that from 1990 to 2013, student scores increased steadily at all levels of performance. This is what's the top 10%, how they performing, what's next level, what's the next level, what's the middle percentage, what's the lowest 10%. That's what these 5 lines are. So you want them all to increase, but they don't all increase. And then when the Common Core standards were beginning to have an effect on what was taught from 2013 to 2019, the top 10% continued to increase. The middle with performance levels stayed about the same, but the lowest 25% began a decline, and that decline has continued until the present time. This graph suggests that the performance of the best students was least affected by the pandemic. I've already mentioned that from 2005 on, that is in the last 20 years, more students have taken calculus in high school than in college. The national assessment data reflects a growing divide between the better performers and poorer performers since the initiation of the Common Core. So why are the better performers getting better? I think it's due to the actions of the College Board, a nonprofit organization made up of high schools and colleges designed to help students transition from high school to college. The College Board is relevant in this discussion because they offer the advanced placement exams. Students receive scores from 1 to 5 on these exams, which last for 3 hours to 3 1/4 hours. Generally, a score of 3 is considered passing, and a score of 4 or 5 typically earns college credit. Here is a list of the advanced placement exams now offered by the College Board, with the years in which they were first offered. Notice the 3 exams are relatively new. In statistics in 1997, in computer science principles, a second computer science set, not the first, the second, that is broader than the first test, which emphasizes the Java programming language. And in 2017, just last, that was done in 2017, and just last year they introduced a pre-calculus exam. Here is a list of the AP enrollments in the mathematical and computer sciences in 1990, 2010, 2019, and 2025. The enrollments of these exams should be compared with a 12th grade population in the United States of about 4 million students. So we see that about 7% of high school graduates took the calculus AB, that's a lower calculus exam, in 2024. That's the most recent data. Here are a few takeaways. There was an extraordinary increase in the number of students who took the advanced placement exam, calculus exam between 1990 and 2010, and a continual increase in 2019. Statistics is a required course in college for students majoring in social sciences and business, and the introduction of the AP statistics exam has been highly successful. The number of students taking this test in 2024 is almost double the number taking it in 2010, with comparable scores in 2010 and 2024, despite the increased number. What this means is many of the best students are taking 2 courses in the mathematical sciences in 11th or 12th grade. This was unknown 30 years ago. And for many college students who are not interested in mathematics, science, engineering, computer science, or information science, and are more interested in history, political science, psychology, literature, or arts, statistics has become a popular alternative to pre-calculus mathematics in their last year of high school. Finally, the introduction of the AP pre-calculus exam has been immediately popular. I've not seen the data, but my guess is that many of the best students are taking this exam in 10th or 11th grade before they take an AP calculus exam. So they get used to taking an exam under these circumstances. We can come back to this table if you wish, but I'd like to move on. For me, the message here is that the Common Core has had little effect on the performance of the best students, but the advanced placement program of the College Board has had a very positive influence. It will come as no surprise to you that students of Asian ancestry are overrepresented in these advanced placement data compared to the numbers in the general population. I don't get any reaction from you, but that's because it comes as no surprise to you. But missing in these advanced placement data are the vast majority of students whose performance has not improved. Not only has there been no change in the Common Core since 2010, to my knowledge, there's no ongoing committee planning to change it. So I'll close the 75-year overview of mathematics education in the United States. If you want, I'm going to give you a brief picture of the Common Core. It consists of content standards for grades K through 8, content standards for grades 9 through 12, organized by content area, and they're identified on this slide. You can see number and algebra and functions. All of the Common Core standards are detailed on the corresponding website. In the early drafts, there were only the content standards. In the drafts, it didn't appear. The K-12 mathematics educators on the committee demanded that there be some sort of process standard, not just content standard, and this resulted in 8 process standards for mathematical practice. This was a positive move, but these standards don't lend themselves for being tested the way content standards are. Process standards are best understood by observant classrooms and teaching. And from the page numbers, we see that only 3 pages are devoted to the standards for mathematical practice. That's less than devoted in any grade level. So it's clear. To the people who wrote the Common Core, this is just, we'll let the mathematics educators have their say, but really we're going to do it. Here are the 8 standards for mathematical practice. They're meant to be applied. We see the influence of the earlier decades. The first repeats the importance of problem solving, the emphasis of the 1980s. The second is an echo of the new math of 1960s. The next 3 bullets are extensions of the work of the 1990s. The last 3 are not particularly important to me. Over the 3, they're just nice things. Here I'd like to focus on the 5th standard, use appropriate tools strategically. It shows the battles between the reformers and the traditionalists. What does use appropriate tools strategically mean? This is the full description of that process standard. Mathematically proficient, it begins with the statement, mathematically proficient students consider the available tools, and so on. These tools might include pencil and paper, concrete models, a ruler, a project, a calculator, a spreadsheet, A computer algebra system, a statistical package, or dynamic geometry software. This is a process standard. It looks pretty good. It seems like it's the message of a forward-looking document. But notice what the statement feels the need to repeat 4 times. It starts mathematically proficient students, which means, oh, after they're proficient, then we can use these things. But to gain proficiency, to help them actually learn, forget it. That's what this really means, to me, a skeptic. And we see this translated into the content standards, where the word calculator is not mentioned until grade 7, not mentioned. And there's no mention of a graphing calculator anywhere in the Common Core. And the Common Core came out many, many years, 15 years after Casio and Texas Instruments had graphing calculators that were being used all through high schools and required on the college entrance test. Required. And not one paper and pencil computational skill is thought to be obsolete. Notice this standard. Fluently divide multi-digit numbers using the standard algorithm. And researchers have said there is no standard algorithm. People use different ways of doing these things. Just the fact of calling something a standard algorithm is sort of ignoring the research community in mathematics education. Very interesting. But of all the content statements, the one that's had the most pushback is the ignorance of data collection in grades 1 through 4. There's no data collection when you're learning about number. And basically it's been ignored. It was ignored completely by UCSFD everyday mathematics. And they have to have a thing why we are ignoring this, because it's not in the. But one content standard that makes me feel really good, and I might say, well, let me say before that, the algebra standards are really quite good. They spent a lot of time on algebra, and the algebra standards are quite good. And one content standard in grade 8 makes me feel really good. They said we should define congruence and similarity in terms of geometric transformations, which had gone back to my first work. It was the first time the transformations were said. It's essential that you start out with that transformation. And I'm going to finish with the. Oh, I didn't. I would be ignoring a major factor if I didn't say that, particularly in grades K through 8, there's an organization called Ed Reports that rates curricula on many dimensions, including focus, coherence, rigor, the standards for mathematical practice, and also on supports for multilingual learners. These ratings particularly have impact on publishers of materials for grades K through 6, my life works, where teachers are not as well prepared in mathematics and do not feel as qualified to judge materials, and so value outside help. They look to this. The Ed Reports rating system has been very strict, not considering alternate routes to mathematical understanding or skills, or alternate rates of growth. So, for example, materials from Singapore and Japan that are adapted or sold as is for the United States market have never received acceptable ratings. They're unacceptable because they don't meet strict criteria. Nor have any of the materials of the NSF projects of the 1990s. None of the 13 projects have had their materials given an imprimatur by Ed Reports. The Common Core has greatly impeded curriculum development in the United States, and some would say it's killed it altogether. In some, here's my situation, summary of the situation in 2025. With few exceptions, the Common Core is the standard mathematics curriculum in the United States. There are no large-scale curriculum development projects now ongoing. Due to the increased influence of the AP programs, and perhaps a vestige of our influence, over a third of students have had a full-year algebra course before grade 9. Statistics has emerged and continues to grow, and curriculum remains very much behind the times when it comes to technology. And yet AI has not yet had influence. Is significant change in the offering? Maybe. In July of this year, the Mathematical Association of America distributed an open letter on the need to modernize the mathematical sciences, noting that in order to maintain a thriving STEM community, we need to broaden our view of mathematics content beyond calculus to meet today's challenges to include statistical reasoning, mathematical modeling, computational reasoning, and data analysis while keeping the vital importance of mastering basic skills in algebra. When I checked last week, 438 people had signed on to this report. These are all college level. And NCTM has announced that a major report in K-12 mathematics will be announced in October of next year. October next 11 months. This has been a long presentation. Thank you for enabling me to give it. If you would like a PDF of the PowerPoint, email me at the address on this slide. Thank you very much.
Presentation. So we still have time for Q&A.
I couldn't have answered every question you had.
Thank you, Professor. I don't have a lot of questions, but I will ask just a few. I feel when we see the influence of the curriculum or reform initiatives, are you talking about the causal relationship? Because students' learning outcomes, to me, might be related to a lot of factors, not just the curriculum or textbooks. So that's my question.
Well, I understand. I do understand. Does this really work? Okay.
I mean, how do you feel
I understand.
Curriculum and students' learning?
What I did not mention is the out-of-school learning. I did not mention after-school schools like in Korea and in Singapore. I mean, I was devoted to what happens in school. I have 2 grandchildren, and I see what happens when you have essentially school after school at home. You don't need to have even formal schooling, but I like to say that in fact they have been schooled at home since birth. Since the day they came home from the hospital, and they go to school, mind you. It's not because they don't go to the public school in their area, but when they come home, there's other things going on. There's this activity, that activity, that, and it's all part of education. And it's clear that that's why the top performers are not so much affected by what happens in Common Core and in any other curriculum, because the parents are there. And it is, and I might say, when I said that Asian students tend to score higher, this is a parental influence, and in my generation, it was Jewish students. It's absolutely similar. When it came to the Supreme Court about getting into college and having limits on the percent of Asian students, some of the colleges, Harvard had limits and so on. What people didn't understand is how high those limits were. These limits were not like 3% of the population. It wasn't anything related to the percent in the population. It was a very high percent compared to the percent in the population. It was just that they wanted to have some diversity in their population. So the influence, what I think you're saying is absolutely correct. I did not talk about the out-of-school influences. This was about the curriculum. And sort of, you might say, even the formal curriculum.
Thank you very much. Anyone else have questions?
I might say that in the other presentation that I'm giving next week, I talk about, one of the things I talk about is that there are different kinds of curriculum.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. And I have a tiny question about a tiny topic you mentioned, no child left behind. So I know education is always around equity, and no child left behind was proposed because of equity. That's a huge topic. So I would like to ask your perspective about no child left behind, because I used to, when I used to do research on no child left behind, I mostly get a negative comment on this action, because they say it's not, even though it's for equity, but it's not good for those gifted students or like for creative education. So I would like to hear your opinion. Thank you.
That's a very good question, right?
No, it's a great question. No child left behind has nothing to do with equity.
Oh, really?
Nothing to do with equity. It had to do with performance. And in 2001, when no child left, equity was not really big on the agenda. Now, equity is big on the agenda of the major organizations in the United States. But in 2001, it wasn't there. This was because this was an effort to get your low performers up. It wasn't about equity, and there wasn't any notion, oh, our low performers are coming from this group or that group or anything like that. It wasn't, I know that may not be what you thought, but that's the reason that people are saying it has little to do with it, because they think they have very little to do with equity. But now, people talk about equity. And it's very difficult. Equity is very difficult. Prejudging students based on particular characteristics of the student that have nothing to do with their learning, including their color, where they come from, the second language students instead of first language. Those are the kinds of things now that are in the forefront, but they weren't there 25 years ago.
Thanks very much. I was a little bit, surprised to see, when you develop the textbook in the U.S. Yes, the project, you also translate the nice textbook from the former Soviet Union. Because the whole mass education in China actually was pretty much influenced by the former Soviet Union and the mass education historically, because of the historical reasons. So my question is, what kind of information, if you still remember, what kind of information you take from the textbook, or what kind of information you give up?
What did we learn from the Soviet?
Yes.
I actually wrote an article on this, but it was on what we learned from grades K through 4. The first 4, kindergarten and grades 1 through 4. This is what was startling to us. It was not so startling what happened later. It's mathematics. It's just, what you decided. The K through 4 just took students in directions that we did not have in the United States. It assumed that actually students could do things. I mean, that they could think through, that they could, whereas it was a much more static kind of education in the United States. So when we translated that information went into everyday mathematics, not into the work so much that I was doing, but that was the most significant. The Japanese, to me, was more significant. And that was that they were doing in grades 7 through 8 what we were doing in grades 9 and 10. There was no, what can I say? We were waiting until high school to teach certain things. in the United States, most of the education, we don't have smooth from 7 through 12. We have at grade 8, most places in the country, there's a graduation from what's called an elementary school into a high school. And so in many places, you would not teach algebra because that was the high school's job. It's not your job. And that was what we were trying to break. And since that time, I might say, now you have much more. 7th and 8th grade teachers are expected to be able to teach those subjects.
Do you have other questions? Okay, I ask one more thing for. I would like to know, the influence of AI on the current development of mass curriculum. Is there any influence of AI? Was there disturbance mass curriculum reform?
And most of what first of all, I'm not in the classroom, so I cannot tell you personal influence, except that I know when I get information from the internet, it's AI, almost always. Unless it's somebody's article that they put their name on. If I ask for information about something, I'm getting an AI response. And the question is, do I trust it? For the most part in teaching, teachers are using it to develop some lesson plans. Maybe my wife can respond more to that about AI. For lesson plans, for grading things, I think it's having more of an influence outside of mathematics than inside. For teachers who want to grade essays, student writing, using AI to grade the student writing, more than in mathematics, which is much more easier to grade than some of the other things. But we haven't yet really seen, and you know, what the implications of AI are on everything. Research. You want to know the research? Oh, just put into, what is the research on? And then put something there and see what you get back. And it used to take us a long time to develop through all sorts of materials to find out the answer to that question. Now you can get that. Much more of an influence on doctoral students than I think in classrooms. You know. So
I just have a very minor question. Because you mentioned problem solving. A lot of studies started in the 1980s about problem solving, right? So I'm wondering, what is the role of problem solving kind of teaching pedagogy in the current mathematics education, especially for the young kids, for kindergarten kids and maybe primary 1 to 3 things.
I want to see if there's any.
The Common Core, in terms of the applications of addition, subtraction, and multiplication and division, which is a lot of the problem solving at those young grades, does do a nice job. I have ways to improve it, but they did a pretty good job of describing these different use cases for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And so that is a plus thing in the Common Core, and has been helpful. But the emphasis on the computational skills, and part of the Ed reports follows a guideline about what percent of the content should be on major clusters, and those are groupings of standards in the Common Core. And this came out when the Common Core came out, within 5 years, they were saying you must spend like 65 to 85% of your time on major clusters, and the major clusters were almost all a number in operation. And that is part of what has got the curriculum by the throat in terms of de-emphasizing skills kids don't really need, and no room or time to do more with statistics, which is the weakest strand and whatnot. So until And the ed reports that he mentioned is like the police. You have to get all green on ed reports as in publishers' books. So, you know, we'll have 14 lessons on adding with same denominator because we got to hit certain quotas and stuff, and it's just silly. So the I think that the uses of operations is really good, and the bar diagrams that came from Singapore, awesome for little kids, you know, all those kinds of things. So the problem solving in elementary is in better shape than it's used to be, I think. One other thing about AI, I went to the NCTM meeting 3 weeks ago, and the ability of AI to take students work done on a tablet or work done on paper. They're doing sketches, they're writing things with bad handwriting or whatever. You scan it, and then the AI can read what the student is doing, and in seconds comes back with, not always 100% accurate, but it can say, I see that you understood this. Oh, you did a good job on that. You might want to check the calculation on that one. And it's just the super AI is coming. I heard her talk, they said it might be here in 6 months or it might be here in 4 years or something. But the ability to do that kind of scoring and feedback to the student. One of the systems has one where at the beginning of the grade, that each day, the introductory thing for each student is customized to the prerequisite skills that they might be weak on for that day's lesson. And it's just, you know, it's all done in seconds, and it's just taking off. So we can never get rid of the Common Core. It's going to be really cool.
Thank you for answering the 2 questions.
You should know that person is my wife. Because you didn't know, and she has worked for one of the major textbook publishers in the United States. You want to say how many years? Should I say how many years?
No.
Very long.
Longer than almost anybody in this world, in this room, has been alive, and maybe longer than many of your parents have been alive, and is expert in K through 5.
Do you have any further questions before we finish? Maybe I ask one more. Can I ask one more?
Yes.
Because it's very unusual to see when you see SAP develop textbooks, they test it in classrooms. So other publishers or in USA, as I mentioned, or in other countries, they just develop it and then they sell it. They might need to get approval from examination board or the Ministry of Education. But you mentioned a 3-year testing cycle. Was this really helpful for textbook development?
Very much.
Ah,
Okay, well, let me see. I actually wrote something. So, I'll describe the development process, the 3 years. The first year we call the pilot year. We bring in authors. I should also point out how we selected the authors. This was not normal. We would have people apply to be authors. Not to cheat the head of the team. The head of the team we selected in advance. This is somebody we knew to be really good, so. But who was on the team, we would bring them in for essentially an audition. They were asked to write 2 lessons before they came, then who would be invited to be an audition. They were asked to write 2 lessons. One was a lesson that they had written, anything they wanted to that was in that course. The other was a lesson in something we picked. So we would pick a topic and say, write a lesson on this. And then, in a particular style. Having chosen maybe 10 people to come in, a small number of people, maybe 8 to 10 people, we wanted to choose teams of 6. Our goal was a team of 6 people. So we needed 5, because we already had the head. We would bring them in for a day. In the morning, they were asked to help plan a lesson together. And then in the afternoon, they were asked to write the lesson in an afternoon. Because we need people who can write quickly.
So you needed to have a lot of money to support them, right? You did
To have them come in, we paid for them for the summer. To come in later, we paid for them to come in for the audition, and then we paid for them to come in the summer. Yes, and we used university housing to house these people. And so, I mean, often we would have 1 or 2 would be local, and so we wouldn't have to pay for housing for them. But when we got them together to plan, we would find that some people just were not good in a group. They were negative. They were not. We needed a team that could be cohesive and positive and so on. So it's very important. And the other thing is, we made no distinction between college and high school teachers and middle school. We did make no distinction in picking our people. We didn't care where they came from.
My real question is, should I answer?
Well, then we have the 3 years.
Yeah.
Okay, then the first year, so they would write a draft in the summer, as much as could be written. Almost the entire course is written in the summer. Now, either they, that is the authors, or what we call surrogates of the authors, were the only teachers the first year. The only teachers. And when I say a surrogate, I mean if you have a college professor, they can't be expected to teach a high school course. So they would have somebody they knew they could talk to every day to tell them, how did this lesson go? How did that lesson go? And then we bring them in to talk about how, that's the first year, that's the pilot year. Then the next summer, we don't have all 6 come back, we have maybe 4 come back. And we revised for the second year. And the second year, we would allow the course to be available a little wider. Maybe now the second year is 20 schools or so using the materials. Again, bringing people in periodically, not as often, for the second year, bringing in, because those schools may not all be from the Chicago area. Mostly were trying to do little things in the Chicago area for cost. It's expensive to bring people in. And then the third year is when we do what we call the summative year. We have a formative year, and it's pilot, formative, summative. And the summative year was the third year where we let school, anybody who wants to use the materials, we're going to test some of them. And what we found at the beginning was schools really liked the materials, and they wanted to adopt the materials before we even had a publisher. And, you know, so
Yeah, so my real question actually was, so parents will not complain if you don't use the formal or use kind of, you're testing your new materials. Will parents complain? In this place?
we never had that
Okay,
problem.
thank you very much.
I think, you know, but I think part of it is the University of Chicago has a pretty good reputation.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm serious about that. I mean, and you cannot dismiss that, because you need that. You need to have people who have faith in you. If they don't have faith in you, so we never had problems. Is our mathematics good enough? We have a wonderful mathematics department. Therefore, even if we were bad, we would still get away with you know. But we weren't. We were pretty careful. We had I might say, you know, you have a university with a reputation. You have to maintain that reputation. And so there was a responsibility. It's not just that you can do whatever you want.
Any other questions? If not, then we can close this session, right? Thank you for coming.